Case 1. Sergeant Alexander Blackman, Marine A. In March 2011, Sergeant Alexander Blackman kissed his wife Claire goodbye at their home in Taunton, Somerset, and deployed to Helmand Province, Afghanistan, with the Plymouth-based 42 Commando Unit. He was 39 years old. He had served in the Royal Marines for 15 years. He had completed 6 operational tours across Northern Ireland, Iraq, and Afghanistan. He stood 6 feet 3 inches tall, was an expert in heavy weapons including machine guns, and had been recommended for promotion to colour sergeant. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Simon Chapman, considered him a safe pair of hands. His service records described him as an outstanding commander. By the time he came home 7 months later, none of that would matter. Alexander Blackman would become the first British soldier convicted of murder on a foreign battlefield since the Second World War. His unit was sent to one of the most dangerous areas in all of Afghanistan. Nad-e-Ali in the Helmand province was a known hotspot for Taliban activity. British forces had been fighting there for years. IEDs lined the roads. Ambushes were constant. Several Marines from Blackman's unit were killed during the tour, including his troop commander. Blackman was posted to Command Post Omar, a remote outpost where he was put in charge of 15 younger Royal Marines. The conditions were terrible. Equipment was limited. Supplies were short. Blackman could not sleep properly. He was allowed just 1 visit from his commanding officer during the entire posting, which showed how stretched the unit was. His father had died earlier that year, and the grief weighed on him, even as he tried to hold everything together for the men under his command. He complained to headquarters repeatedly that he did not have enough men to carry out his assigned tasks. Those complaints went unanswered. For month after month, the pressure built. Blackman was isolated, exhausted, and increasingly unable to process what he was experiencing. He had already served in some of the most hostile places on earth, across 3 tours in Iraq, 1 in Northern Ireland, and now his 2nd tour in Afghanistan. But this posting was different. Fellow soldiers who served in the same area described it as the most contested ground in all of Helmand. The Taliban fighters in the region were well armed, well organised, and ruthless. Torture and death awaited any soldier who fell into their hands. Bodies of fallen British troops had been desecrated. The threat was constant, and it was everywhere. By the time September came, 5 months into the 6-month tour, Alexander Blackman was not the same man who had left Taunton in the spring. On the afternoon of September 15, 2011, Taliban insurgents attacked a small British patrol base called CP Talanda. The operations room at Forward Operating Base Shahzad observed 2 armed insurgents in the area using the PGSS, a surveillance camera mounted on a balloon above the base. An Apache helicopter from Camp Bastion was called in. It fired on one of the insurgents in an open field, seriously wounding him. Blackman and a patrol of Marines, including Corporal Christopher Watson and Marine Jack Hammond, were sent out to do what was called a battle damage assessment. That meant going to see what the helicopter strike had done and reporting back on what they found. When the patrol reached the field, they found the Taliban fighter lying on the ground, badly wounded from the helicopter gunfire. He was still alive. The Marines took his AK-47 rifle, 2 magazines, and a hand grenade. At that point, some members of the patrol began giving the man first aid. Then Blackman made a decision that would end his career, send him to prison, and divide an entire nation. He ordered his men to stop treating the wounded fighter. He ordered that the man be dragged to a different location, out of sight of the PGSS surveillance camera above FOB Shahzad. The patrol dragged the injured Afghan across the field. Some of the Marines kicked him as they moved him. Blackman did nothing to stop them. Once they were in a position where the camera could not see them, Blackman drew his 9mm pistol and shot the wounded, unarmed man in the chest. As the man convulsed and died in front of him, Blackman said words that would later be played in a courtroom and broadcast across the world. He quoted Shakespeare. He said, "There you are. Shuffle off this mortal coil, you cunt. It's nothing you wouldn't do to us." Then he turned to his fellow Marines and said something that proved beyond any doubt he knew exactly what he had done. He said, "Obviously this doesn't go anywhere, fellas. I just broke the Geneva Convention." One of the Marines replied, "Yeah, Roger, mate." The entire thing was caught on a helmet-mounted camera worn by one of the Marines on the patrol. Blackman did not know the camera was recording. He finished the rest of his tour without incident. He left Afghanistan in late October 2011 and returned to his wife in Taunton. For a full year, nobody knew what had happened in that field. Then in September 2012, civilian police investigating a completely unrelated crime found the video footage on a Royal Marines laptop. The footage was turned over to the Royal Military Police. On October 11, 2012, 7 unnamed Royal Marines were arrested on suspicion of murder. The charges against 4 of the Marines were eventually dropped. 3 went to trial. Blackman, Watson and Hammond were tried by court-martial at the Military Court Centre in Bulford, Wiltshire. During the trial, their identities were hidden behind an anonymity order. Blackman was called Marine A, Watson was Marine B, Hammond was Marine C. The trial began on October 23, 2013 and lasted 2 weeks. It was heard by Judge Advocate General Jeff Blackett and a 7-member court-martial board made up of officers and senior non-commissioned officers. All 3 Marines pled not guilty. The prosecution's case was built almost entirely on the helmet camera footage. The video showed everything: the wounded man on the ground, the patrol dragging him across the field, Blackman giving the order to stop first aid, the pistol shot to the chest, the Shakespeare quote, the admission that he had just broken the Geneva Convention. Blackman's defence was that he believed the Taliban fighter was already dead when he fired the shot. He said he was taking his anger out on a corpse, not killing a living person. But the footage told a different story. The prosecution argued that this was a deliberate execution of a wounded prisoner of war. On November 8, 2013, Watson and Hammond were both found not guilty. Alexander Blackman was convicted of murder. It was the first conviction of its kind for a British soldier on a foreign battlefield since World War II. Royal Marines Brigadier Bill Dunham called the killing a shocking and appalling aberration. General Sir Nick Houghton said simply, "Murder is murder." On December 5, 2013, a court ruled that Blackman's anonymity should be lifted. The next day, December 6, 2013, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 10 years. He was reduced to the ranks and dismissed with disgrace from Her Majesty's service. After 15 years of distinguished service, 6 operational tours, and a career that had once been headed towards further promotion, Alexander Blackman was led away to begin his sentence in a civilian prison. But the case did not end there. What happened next turned a military court-martial into one of the most divisive public debates Britain had seen in years. Blackman's wife Claire launched a campaign to free her husband. The Daily Mail newspaper backed her. Readers donated around £800,000 to a legal fund. More than 100,000 people signed a petition calling for Blackman's release. Colonel Oliver Lee, a commanding officer who had served during the same operation, resigned his commission in protest, saying he had been prevented from giving evidence at the original trial about failures in the chain of command. Thriller novelist Frederick Forsyth and multiple members of Parliament joined the campaign. In May 2014, Blackman's first appeal against his conviction was rejected by the Court-Martial Appeal Court. But the judges did reduce his minimum sentence from 10 years to 8, recognising the combat stress he had been under. Then, in December 2015, Blackman applied to the Criminal Cases Review Commission. His new legal team, led by Jonathan Goldberg QC, submitted over 1,100 pages of new evidence. The CCRC investigated and concluded that Blackman's original defence team had fallen way below the standard expected. They found that no psychiatric evidence had been presented at trial, even though Blackman had been suffering from a recognised mental illness at the time of the killing. The CCRC sent the case back to the appeal court. On February 7, 2017, 5 judges, including the Lord Chief Justice, began hearing the appeal. On March 15, 2017, they made their ruling. The murder conviction was quashed. It was replaced with a conviction for manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. The judges said Blackman had been an exemplary soldier before his deployment to Afghanistan, but that he had suffered from quite exceptional stresses during the tour, and that an adjustment disorder had substantially impaired his ability to form a rational judgment. They made clear, however, that this did not absolve him of responsibility. They said, "This was a deliberate killing of a wounded man. He still retained a substantial responsibility for the deliberate killing." On March 28, 2017, Blackman was given a new sentence of 7 years. He had already served 3.5. On April 28, 2017, Alexander Blackman was released from Earlstoke Prison in Wiltshire. He was taken out in the early hours of the morning by police to avoid the media. He went home to Taunton, to Clare. The case changed the conversation about what happens to soldiers who serve in extreme combat conditions and then do something unforgivable. A Royal Navy internal review found that Blackman had allowed professional standards to slip to an unacceptably low level, and that moral disengagement on his part was a significant factor in the killing. The review also confirmed what many had suspected, that the culture within 42 Commando during that tour was perceived by many to be overly aggressive, and that members of the unit felt the chain of command had failed to provide them with adequate support. Blackman admitted in later interviews that the shooting was wrong. He said he could not fully explain why he pulled the trigger. He said he was healthy, employed, and that he and Clare had stayed together. His dismissal from the Royal Marines remains in place, though the "with disgrace" part was removed after the manslaughter verdict. He is no longer a murderer in the eyes of the law, but the unnamed Taliban fighter he shot in that field on September 15, 2011, a man whose name was never publicly recorded, is still dead, and every conversation about the rules of war, the limits of what soldiers can be expected to endure, and the price of crossing the line that separates a warrior from a criminal, still runs through this case. 454 British service personnel died in Afghanistan. Thousands more came home with wounds both visible and invisible. Alexander Blackman came home with both. He crossed that line once, on a September afternoon in a field in Helmand, and it cost him everything he had built in 15 years of service. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Alexander Blackman crossed that line once, and it cost him everything he had built in 15 years of service. But the next soldier on this list did not cross the line on a battlefield thousands of miles away. He crossed it on home soil, against 3 of his own colleagues, for nothing more than a bag of cash. Case 2. Corporal Andrew Walker, the payroll killer. On the morning of January 17, 1985, the ground around Glencorse Barracks in Pennycook, Mid Lothian, was covered in snow. It was a Thursday. That meant it was payday. Every Thursday, regular as clockwork, a Land Rover and a crew of 3 soldiers left the barracks and drove into the nearby town of Pennycook to collect the weekly payroll from a branch of the Royal Bank of Scotland. No special security arrangements were made. The escort was unarmed. It was a routine trip that took about 40 minutes there and back. On this particular Thursday, 3 men climbed into the Land Rover. Retired Major David Cunningham, 56 years old, Staff Sergeant Terence Hosker, 39, of the Royal Army Pay Corps, a bachelor who had only recently transferred to the unit, and Private John Thompson, 25, of the King's Own Scottish Borderers, a young soldier from Galashiels who had a 2.5-year-old son named Bruce and a 19-year-old wife named Susan. It was Thompson's first payroll run. He was the driver. They collected the money from the bank without any problems. The payroll was roughly £19,000, stuffed into a sack. As they drove away from the bank and headed back towards the barracks, a figure in army uniform flagged them down and asked for a lift. They knew him. He was a fellow soldier based at Glencorse. His name was Corporal Andrew Walker, 30 years old, of the Royal Scots. They let him climb into the back of the Land Rover. What they did not know was that under his army coat, Walker was hiding a Sterling submachine gun he had signed out of the barracks armoury at 8 o'clock that morning. Walker had planned this for months. He had hitched rides in the payroll Land Rover in both November and December of 1984, testing the route, watching the procedures, and working out exactly how to breach the security. He knew the timing, the route, and the fact that the escort was unarmed. He had debts. He owed £2,000 on a car. He was about to take delivery of a new motor worth £8,500. He was due to leave for a posting to West Germany and wanted cash to set himself up before he left, leaving behind his wife and 2 young children. Once inside the vehicle, Walker pulled the gun. He forced the men to drive away from the town and into the Pentland Hills, a stretch of remote countryside south of Edinburgh. Staff Sergeant Hosker was not the kind of man to go quietly. He tried to tackle Walker. Walker shot him in the head and chest. After that, Walker ordered Private Thompson to keep driving along a quiet track towards Flotterstone Reservoir and the remote, disused Loganlea Cottage. On the way, he shot Major Cunningham through the head. Thompson, the 25-year-old driver on his first pay run, was now alone with a man who had just killed 2 people in front of him. Walker forced Thompson to stop near the cottage and unload the bodies of his 2 dead colleagues from the vehicle. Thompson did as he was told. Then Walker shot him too. Once in the head, once in the abdomen. He left no witnesses. Walker grabbed the sack of money and prepared to make his escape. His plan had been to drive the Land Rover back to the main road, clean the gun, return it to the armoury before anyone noticed, and go about his day as if nothing had happened. He would collect the buried cash later, once the attention had died down. But his plan fell apart almost immediately. The snowy track was icy and treacherous. The Land Rover skidded off the path and into a ditch. The engine was still running, the headlights were still on, the windscreen wipers were still going. Blood was dripping from inside the vehicle. Walker was now on foot, in the snow, in uniform, carrying a bloodied weapon and a bag of stolen cash. He was a trained soldier. He knew about concealment. He hid the money somewhere in the Pentland Hills. Then he hitched a lift towards Edinburgh, doubled back towards Pennycook, picked up a Fiat Mirafiori he had borrowed from a fellow soldier, and tried to go about establishing his alibi. He returned the submachine gun to the armoury at 2 o'clock that afternoon. Nobody raised any concerns at that time, but within hours, the crime scene was discovered. A local farmer found the Land Rover stuck in the ditch with its lights still glowing. He saw the blood on the front seat and the shattered window. He reported it to the police, who were already looking for the vehicle, because army officials at Glencorse Barracks had raised the alarm when the pay crew did not return. Police followed a trail of blood through the snow from the crashed Land Rover to Loganlea Cottage. Behind the cottage, they found the bodies of all 3 soldiers. 2 had been shot in the back of the head, execution style. The 3rd had been sprayed with bullets across the chest and abdomen. The sack of payroll money was gone. At first, investigators considered whether this was a terrorist attack. The Provisional IRA was active on the British mainland in 1985, and they had a history of targeting military personnel. But the theory fell apart quickly. The IRA had never carried out an attack in Scotland, privately considering the Scots off-limits, and no group claimed responsibility. Detectives quickly turned their attention to the barracks itself. A witness near the bank had seen 4 men in the Land Rover, not 3. Police checked the armoury logs and found that every soldier who had signed out a weapon that day could be accounted for and eliminated from the investigation, except one, Corporal Andrew Walker. Ballistic tests confirmed that the submachine gun Walker had signed out was the weapon that killed all 3 men. Walker went absent without leave for 3 days after the killings, then returned to the barracks and denied any knowledge of the murders. He was arrested. While waiting for trial on remand, Walker shared a cell with an 18-year-old prisoner named Andrew Loden. According to Loden, Walker was violent towards him, threatened to kill Loden's father and girlfriend, and on the eve of the trial, confessed to the murders in graphic detail. Walker then blackmailed Loudon into smuggling a letter out of the prison that blamed the killings on the IRA. The letter was found by prison guards before it got out. Loudon was later called as a prosecution witness at Walker's trial. The trial took place at the High Court in Edinburgh in May 1985. 125 witnesses gave evidence. Walker claimed he was driving between Kirknewton and Edinburgh at the time of the shootings. He said the bullet casings linking him to the murder weapon had been planted. The jury did not believe a word of it. Walker was found guilty of 3 counts of murder, the theft of the money, and attempting to pervert the course of justice for the smuggled letter. The judge, Lord Grieve, sentenced him to life imprisonment with a recommendation that he serve at least 30 years before being eligible for parole. At the time, it was the longest sentence ever handed down in Scotland. Lord Grieve's words were direct and brutal. He said, "This was a calculated crime. The accused, if he was to achieve his purpose, had to kill. I am quite satisfied that the crime was carefully planned, and I am also quite sure that the substance of the evidence given by Walker was a tissue of lies." He called the murders callous, brutal, and calculated. Walker's army career had started well. He had completed 3 tours of Northern Ireland and received a mention in dispatches for his service. His fellow soldiers knew him as Billy Liar because of his constant boasting and tall stories. He had been a talented amateur boxer in his younger years, reaching the semi-finals of the National Amateur Boxing Championships while fighting for his Edinburgh club, Sparta. But in the months before the murders, things had gone badly wrong. He had been in repeated trouble and faced disciplinary action. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Clive Fairweather, had warned him directly. Fairweather told Walker, "Unless you get a grip of yourself, I can see you wearing a blue suit and eating porridge." He turned out to be exactly right. Prison did not quiet Walker down. In September 1987, he was a key participant in a violent riot at Peterhead Prison in Aberdeenshire, one of the most notorious prison sieges in Scottish history. Inmates took over D-Wing, took a prison officer named Jackie Stewart hostage, and held him for 5 days. The siege was only ended when the SAS stormed the building in a dramatic early morning assault. Walker had 9 years added to his sentence for his role in the riot. While behind bars at HMP Shotts in Lanarkshire, Walker became one of Scotland's most dangerous inmates. He regularly boasted to fellow prisoners about his buried cash in the Pentland Hills. He used the promise of a share of the stolen payroll to persuade other inmates to do him favours. He contacted newspapers. He taunted people with the secret of where the money was hidden. But he never told anyone the location. Not once. In 2002, Walker successfully appealed to have his minimum sentence reduced from 30 years to 27, arguing he should not have been treated more harshly than other murderers. In 2009, he suffered a massive stroke in his cell that left him severely disabled. He was transferred from Shotts Prison to Wishaw General Hospital, where he was kept under round-the-clock supervision. In December 2011, Andrew Walker was released from prison on compassionate grounds. He was moved to a care home, the identity of which was kept secret. He never admitted his guilt. He never told anyone where the money was hidden. He never showed a moment of remorse for what he had done. On September 3rd, 2021, Andrew Walker died at Murdoston Castle Care Home in Wishaw, Lanarkshire, aged 67. The cause was suspected cancer and another stroke. He took the secret of the buried £19,000 with him to his grave. The money has never been found. Several searches of the Pentland Hills over the decades turned up nothing. A former detective who worked the case put it simply. He said, "The money is still missing. Maybe it's still buried in the hills. It's a trifling amount when you consider the loss of life." Walker's murders left 4 children fatherless. Private Thompson's son Bruce was 2.5 years old when his father was killed. Major Cunningham had 3 children aged between 16 and 23. Thompson's widow, Susan, who was just 19 when her husband was shot dead, gave an interview in 2019, 34 years after the murders. She said, "Each year he lives on, I get angrier." 2 years later, Walker was dead, but the anger she carried did not die with him. Some wounds do not close just because the person who caused them stops breathing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Andrew Walker killed 3 of his own, fellow soldiers, men who trusted him enough to give him a lift. He did it for £19,000, and he never got to spend a single penny of it. The money sits somewhere in those hills to this day, if it has not rotted away entirely. But at least Walker's victims were adults, soldiers who understood the risks of military life, even if they could never have imagined the risk was sitting in the back seat. The next case on this list involves a former soldier whose targets had no connection to the military at all, and whose crime was so savage that the judge made sure he will never walk free again. Case 3. Kyle Clifford, the crossbow killer. On June 26, 2024, a 25-year-old dog groomer named Louise Hunt sent a message to her boyfriend of 18 months, Kyle Clifford, ending their relationship. She was gentle about it. She told him she felt the relationship was broken and that she could not ignore how he had made her feel over the course of the year. To make sure she stayed strong in her decision, she wrote herself a private list of things she did not like about Clifford. She had every reason to believe this was the end of it. Clifford appeared to accept the breakup. He did not argue, he did not beg. But within days, he began buying weapons. A compound crossbow, 6 bolts, a 10-inch steel butcher's knife, large quantities of petrol, duct tape, rope. He also ordered a CO2 Glock air pistol, but it did not arrive in time. Louise Hunt had no idea what was coming. Neither did her mother Carol, 61, or her sister Hannah, 28. In less than 2 weeks, all 3 of them would be dead. Kyle Marcus Clifford was born on April 5, 1998, and grew up in Enfield, North London. Violence ran in the family. His older brother, Bradley Clifford, was jailed for life in 2018, with a minimum term of 23 years, for murdering 18-year-old Soban Khan by deliberately driving his Ford Mustang into Khan's moped in Enfield. Kyle joined the British Army in 2019, enlisting with the Queen's Dragoon Guards. An unnamed army source later told the press that Clifford was immature for his age when he joined and had a chip on his shoulder. He struggled with basic military concepts. His 2 years in the army included 286 days at home, claiming to be ill. He never saw active service. His commanding officer's final assessment of him was blunt. It said his character was wholly unsuited to military employment, and that he has no care nor concern beyond himself. Clifford left the army in 2022 without completing his service. After that, he worked briefly at a fire and security firm in St Albans from February to July 2023. By the time of the murders, he was unemployed. Clifford and Louise Hunt had been together for roughly 18 months before she ended things. Louise was a dog groomer who ran her business from an outbuilding at her family's home at 19 Ashlyn Close in Bushey, Hertfordshire, near Watford. Her sister Hannah, 28, was a beautician. Their mother Carol, 61, lived at the address with her husband, John Hunt, a well-known BBC racing commentator and former police officer. The family also had a third daughter, Amy. The police had never had any contact with the family before. They were, by every account, an ordinary and loving family. Before the breakup on June 26th, Kyle Clifford had spoken with his older brother Bradley on 2 occasions in the days leading up to the attack, on July 1st and July 8th. Both phone calls were recorded because Bradley was in prison. During these conversations, Clifford mentioned he had ordered a crossbow. But the judge noted at sentencing that Clifford never told his brother he was planning to hurt anyone. Prosecutors said he may have held back details because he knew the calls were being monitored. After the breakup on June 26th, Clifford moved fast. On June 30th, just 4 days later, he began searching online for crossbows and visiting websites where they could be purchased. Over the next several days, he ordered the crossbow, a Horizon Cornet MXT 405 compound model, along with 6 bolts, the butcher's knife, duct tape, and rope. All of these items were later used in the attack. Prosecutors told the court that his actions were fueled by the kind of violent hatred of women promoted by controversial social media figure Andrew Tate. Digital evidence showed Clifford had searched for Tate's podcast less than 24 hours before the killings. On the afternoon of July 9, 2024, Clifford drove to Ashlyn Close and parked on a nearby street by around 13:40. He waited. Louise was working in her dog grooming business in the outbuilding. Customers came and went through a side gate during the afternoon. Carol was inside the house. At some point, Clifford approached the front door. He told Carol he was there to return some of Louise's belongings. Carol let him in. The judge at his sentencing later noted that Carol had shown Clifford nothing but kindness in the moments before you attacked her. Once inside, Clifford used the butcher's knife to stab Carol to death. Louise entered the house from the outbuilding at 16:11 that afternoon. Shortly afterwards, she was heard screaming. Neighbours described hearing high-pitched screaming, a male voice shouting, and banging noises that continued until about 16:26. After overpowering Louise, Clifford restrained her by the wrists and ankles and gagged her. For the next several hours, he held her captive and raped her. At 17:31, he went to the outbuilding and took Louise's phone. He used it to message her father, John, asking when he would be coming home. He also searched online for whether unplugging a smoke detector would fully disconnect it. Prosecutors said this showed he was planning to burn down the house. Clifford left the property briefly and went into the back garden, returning to the house at 18:20 when he closed the patio blinds. At some point after this, he killed Louise. He then killed Hannah. According to the coroner's inquest, Carol died from stab wounds, while Hannah and Louise died from crossbow bolt injuries. Hannah was found lying in the main doorway of the house. She was still alive when police arrived. She had managed to call both the police and an ambulance. She told the operator that she, her mother, and her sister had all been shot, and that she feared she was going to die. She died at the scene shortly after. Police and paramedics were called to Ashlyn Close just before 7 o'clock that evening. All 3 women were found with serious injuries. Despite the efforts of paramedics, none of them survived. John Hunt, who had been at work, came home to find his wife and 2 of his daughters dead. A massive manhunt was launched immediately. Clifford had fled. Police issued a public appeal for information on his whereabouts, warning people not to approach him because he might still be armed. The search focused heavily on the London borough of Enfield, where Clifford lived on Rendlesham Road. After 22 hours, at around 1800 on July 10th, police found him hiding in undergrowth in a cemetery near his home in Enfield. When he saw armed officers and a police dog approaching, Clifford shot himself in the chest with the crossbow. No police shots were fired. He was treated at the scene and then taken to the Royal London Hospital. The crossbow bolt left him paralysed from the chest down. He has been in a wheelchair ever since. Clifford was arrested on July 11th on suspicion of 3 counts of murder, but could not be questioned for weeks due to his injuries. On September 17th, 2024, he was formally charged with 3 counts of murder, 1 count of false imprisonment of Louise Hunt, and 2 counts of possessing an offensive weapon. He appeared remotely at Westminster Magistrates' Court. A charge of rape was added later. On December 19, 2024, at Cambridge Crown Court, Clifford pleaded not guilty to all charges. Then, on January 22, 2025, he changed his plea to guilty on the 3 murder charges, the false imprisonment charge, and the weapons charges. He continued to deny the rape. The rape trial began on March 3, 2025, at Cambridge Crown Court. It lasted just days. The jury took 45 minutes to find him guilty. It was a unanimous verdict. Sentencing took place on March 11, 2025. Clifford refused to leave his cell at HMP Belmarsh. The judge, Mr. Justice Joel Benathan, decided not to force him to attend, saying the idea of a man in a wheelchair being put in restraints was not appropriate. He added, "If he lacks the courage to face today, so be it." Clifford was sentenced in his absence. Before the sentence was read, John Hunt delivered a victim impact statement to the court. He addressed Clifford directly. He called him callous, cowardly, and vindictive. He told Clifford he could faintly hear the screams of hell and that they were going to roll out the red carpet for him. Amy Hunt, the surviving daughter, also addressed the court. She told Clifford, "Kyle, plainly the Hunt family are human, and you are not." Police officers in the courtroom wept as the statements were read. Mr. Justice Benifin then delivered his sentencing remarks. He did not make the family wait. He opened by telling the court that for each of the 3 murders, the sentence would be life imprisonment with a whole life order. That meant Clifford would never be released. He described Clifford as a jealous man soaked in self-pity, a man who holds women in utter contempt. He said Carol had shown Clifford nothing but kindness. He said Louise had been as gentle as she could in ending the relationship. He said Hannah had done nothing to Clifford, save supporting her little sister. He described letters Clifford had written to his own family from prison as dripping with self-pity. He dismissed Clifford's military service as meaningless, noting the 286 sick days and the commanding officer's assessment that Clifford had no care beyond himself. He called the attacks brutal and cowardly. Kyle Clifford is 26 years old. He will spend every remaining day of his life in prison. He will never apply for parole. He will never walk again. He sits in a wheelchair in HMP Belmarsh, paralysed by the same crossbow bolt he used to kill 2 innocent women. 3 whole life orders. 3 women who did nothing wrong except be connected to a man whose ego could not survive being told no. Senior Crown Prosecutor Lisa Kiff said after the sentencing that Clifford was a murderer and rapist who, at every turn, has attempted to escape the gravity of his actions. She pointed to the pattern. He evaded arrest. He refused to attend his trial. He refused to attend his sentencing. He denied the rape even when the evidence was overwhelming. At no point did he show any remorse for what he had done. Detective Chief Inspector Nick Gardner, who led the investigation, said Clifford had many years ahead of him to consider the consequences of his crimes and the senseless devastation he has brought to others. John Hunt lost his wife of decades and 2 of his 3 daughters in a single evening. He came home from work and found them dead. Amy Hunt lost her mother and both sisters. The family's statement after the killings said simply, "The devastation we are experiencing cannot be put into words." A vigil was held in Bushey for the 3 women. Flowers were laid at the gates of Ashlyn Close. The community grieved for a family that had done nothing to deserve any of this. Carol Hunt was 61. Hannah Hunt was 28. Louise Hunt was 25. None of them are coming back. Clifford took them because a young woman had the courage to walk away from a relationship that was making her unhappy. That decision, the most ordinary and reasonable decision a person can make, cost 3 women their lives. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The first 2 cases on this list involved soldiers who killed during or after military careers that lasted years. Walker served long enough to complete 3 tours of Northern Ireland. Blackman spent 15 years in the Royal Marines. But the next case goes further back in time, to the height of the Northern Ireland Troubles, where a young paratrooper opened fire at a checkpoint and started a political firestorm that would take a decade to resolve. Case 4. Private Lee Clegg, Marine A before Marine A. Shortly before midnight on September 30th, 1990, a stolen blue Vauxhall Astra was being driven through the streets of West Belfast. At the wheel was 17-year-old Martin Peake. In the back seat was 18-year-old Karen Riley. A third passenger, Markowich Gorman, was also in the car. They were joyriders, teenagers doing something reckless and illegal, driving a stolen car around a city where that kind of thing happened all the time. It was the height of the Northern Ireland Troubles. British soldiers patrolled the streets. Checkpoints were set up across Belfast. Car bombs were a constant fear. Every vehicle that did not stop was treated as a potential weapon. The 3 teenagers in the Astra had no weapons. They had no bombs, They had no connection to the IRA or any paramilitary group. They were just kids in a stolen car, and they were about to drive straight into a British Army checkpoint, manned by soldiers from the 3rd Battalion of the Parachute Regiment. The checkpoint was on the Upper Glen Road, in the nationalist Andersonstown area of West Belfast. A police constable named R.W. Gibson was on duty alongside the soldiers. He stepped into the road and flicked on his torch, signalling the approaching car to stop. The Astra did not stop. It accelerated through the checkpoint at high speed. The soldiers opened fire. Private Lee Clegg, a 21-year-old from Bradford, England, was one of the soldiers manning the position. He fired 4 bullets at the car. Other soldiers also fired. In total, 19 bullets struck the vehicle. The car sped down the road, sparks flying from the tailgate before it crashed and rolled over. Martin Peake was shot in the head and died at the scene. Karen Riley was hit by bullets in the back and died shortly after arriving at the Royal Victoria Hospital. Markowicz Gorman survived with minor injuries. 2 teenagers were dead. And the case that followed would become one of the most politically explosive events of the entire Troubles. The critical question was not whether the soldiers had fired. Everyone knew they had. The question was whether the shooting was lawful. Under the rules of engagement, soldiers could use lethal force against a vehicle that was coming towards them and posed a direct threat. A stolen car, hurtling through a checkpoint at high speed, in a city where car bombs were a regular occurrence and killed people without warning, could reasonably be seen as a threat. But the rules were also clear that once a vehicle had passed the checkpoint, it was no longer a threat, and shooting at it as it drove away was not justified. The investigation found that Clegg had fired 4 bullets. His first 3 shots were judged to have been fired at the car as it approached and passed through the checkpoint. Those 3 shots were ruled lawful. But the 4th bullet was the problem. Forensic evidence indicated that Clegg's 4th shot had been fired into the back of the car after it had already passed the checkpoint and was moving away. That bullet struck Karen Riley and killed her. If the 4th bullet went through the back of a car that was driving away, then the soldiers were no longer in danger, and there was no lawful reason to fire. That single bullet turned Lee Clegg from a soldier doing his job into a murderer. But the case did not move quickly. Clegg continued to patrol the streets of Belfast for another 11 months after the shooting. A report from the Director of Public Prosecutions in January 1991 initially recommended no prosecution. However, public pressure mounted after a police constable who had been present at the checkpoint changed his original statement and told investigators what he had really seen that night. In July 1991, a BBC Panorama programme examined the Army's controversial shoot-to-kill policy and featured the events on the Upper Glen Road. The following month, Clegg and several other soldiers were arrested. Clegg and another soldier, Private Barry Aindoe, were charged with murder. Several other soldiers faced lesser charges. The trial took place at Belfast Crown Court in June 1993. There was no jury. Trials related to the Troubles in Northern Ireland were conducted under the diplock system, where a single judge decided the verdict, because of the long-established risk of juror intimidation in cases involving soldiers, police officers, and paramilitary members. 7 soldiers in total were prosecuted as a result of the incident, an unusually high number for a shooting by British forces. Private Lee Clegg was found guilty of the murder of Karen Riley and of attempting to murder Martin Peake. Aindoe was found guilty of the attempted murder of Peake and also of attempting to pervert the course of justice. It later emerged that some of the soldiers had deliberately injured one of the occupants of the car after the crash, in an effort to make it look like the car had struck a member of the patrol. This cover-up made the whole case even uglier. Clegg was sentenced to life imprisonment. He was 25 years old. He became only the 2nd British soldier to be convicted of murdering a civilian in Northern Ireland, since troops were sent there in 1969. Aindoe received 7 years. But the conviction sparked an immediate and furious political reaction that went far beyond the courtroom. Unionists were outraged. They saw Clegg as a soldier who had been doing his duty in impossible conditions and had been thrown to the wolves by the legal system. The Daily Mail launched a campaign for his release. The Daily Telegraph supported petition drives calling for leniency. Senior military figures, including retired parachute regiment generals, lobbied behind the scenes. Politicians on both sides of the aisle spoke out on his behalf. To many in the Unionist community and on the British mainland, the idea that a British soldier could be convicted of murder for shooting at a stolen car that refused to stop at a checkpoint in a war zone was an outrage. Meanwhile, back at the barracks, the soldiers of A Company had erected a sick celebration of the killings. It was a 10-foot mock-up of an Astra car, with a papier-mâché head in the driver's window, red paint marking the fatal head wound, and bullet holes all over the body. Beside the car was a poster that read, "Vauxhall Astra, built by robots, driven by joyriders, stopped by A Company." On the other side, nationalists saw the case completely differently. To them, Karen Riley was an unarmed teenager shot in the back by a British paratrooper. The fact that the soldiers had also tried to cover up what happened only made it worse. The case became a flashpoint in the wider argument about whether the British Army operated with impunity in Northern Ireland, killing civilians and facing no real consequences. In April 1994, Clegg's appeal against his conviction was dismissed. He then appealed to the House of Lords, which also upheld the conviction in January 1995. By this point, he had served less than 4 years, but the political campaign to free him was gaining unstoppable momentum. In March 1995, Northern Ireland Secretary Sir Patrick Mayhew referred Clegg's case to the Life Sentence Review Board. The board met in June 1995 and, by a majority, recommended his release. On June 25, 1995, Lee Clegg was released from prison on licence. He had served less than 4 years of a life sentence for murder. The reaction was explosive. Rioting broke out across nationalist areas of Belfast. Sinn Féin called the release a threat to the peace process. The timing could not have been worse. Northern Ireland was deep in fragile peace negotiations, and the release of a soldier convicted of killing an unarmed Catholic teenager was seen by nationalists as proof that the British government operated a two-tier justice system, one for its own soldiers and another for everyone else. But the legal battle was far from over. Fresh forensic evidence was presented, challenging the trajectory of the bullets that killed Karen Riley. A test shooting was conducted on another Vauxhall Astra by pathologist Ian West and forensic expert Graham Renshaw on June 4, 1995. This new evidence suggested that Clegg's fourth bullet may have entered the side of the car, not the back, which would mean the car had not yet fully passed the checkpoint when he fired. In February 1998, the Northern Ireland Court of Appeal quashed Clegg's murder conviction and ordered a retrial. The retrial took place at Belfast Crown Court before Mr. Justice Kerr. It lasted 39 days. One of the junior lawyers on Clegg's defence team was a young barrister named Keir Starmer, who went on to become the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. On March 11, 1999, the judge delivered his verdict. In a ruling that ran to 190 pages, Mr. Justice Kerr found that the prosecution could not prove beyond reasonable doubt that Clegg's fourth bullet had been fired after the car had passed the checkpoint. He said, "I think it is very likely that he did, but I cannot be sure of it." Clegg was acquitted of the murder of Karen Riley. However, he was convicted of the lesser charge of attempting to wound Martin Peake, who had also died in the shooting. Clegg looked down and wept when the verdict was read. Karen Riley's father, Sean, left the court building without making any comment. There was one final chapter. Clegg appealed the attempting to wound conviction as well. On January 31, 2000, the Northern Ireland Court of Appeal overturned that conviction too, on the grounds that there was uncertainty over the accuracy of the evidence used to convict him. Every conviction against Lee Clegg was now gone. He was a free man with no criminal record. Clegg returned to the parachute regiment. He was promoted to corporal and continued to serve as part of 16 Air Assault Brigade. In September 2007, the Daily Mail reported that Clegg, now a sergeant, would be deploying to Afghanistan in 2008 as a combat medic with the 2nd Battalion Parachute Regiment. A commanding officer was quoted praising his turnaround, noting that 15 years earlier, Clegg had been sitting in a prison cell, serving a life sentence, and now he was back at the sharp end of war, providing medical support to wounded soldiers. Karen Riley was 18 when she died. Martin Peake was 17. They were in a stolen car. They were not armed. They were not terrorists. They did not deserve to die. But Lee Clegg did not deserve, by the final judgment of the courts, to spend his life in prison for what happened either. At the time of his release in 1995, Clegg had an estranged wife named Amanda and a 3-year-old son named Joshua. The case sits in a place where nobody gets to feel clean about the outcome. 2 teenagers are dead, and nobody was ever held criminally accountable for their deaths. A soldier had his life upended for a decade before the courts cleared him of everything. And the arguments about whether the shooting was justified or whether it was cold-blooded murder never truly ended. They continue to this day, more than 30 years later, whenever the name Lee Clegg comes up in conversation in Belfast or anywhere else. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Every case on this list so far has involved a single moment that changed everything. A shot in a field in Helmand, a machine gun in the Pentland Hills, a crossbow in Bushey, a bullet on the Upper Glen Road. But the final case is different. There was no single moment. There were at least 12 of them, spread across 5 years, committed by a man who had spent 11 years in the British Army learning how to take things apart, and then used those skills on human beings in the most horrifying way imaginable. Case 5. Dennis Nilsen, the kindly killer. On the evening of February 8th, 1983, a plumber named Michael Catran was called to a house at 23 Cranley Gardens in Muswell Hill, North London. The tenants had been complaining about blocked drains and a foul smell. Catran lifted the drain cover outside the property and shone his torch down into the pipe. What he saw did not make sense at first. There was flesh in the drain, actual flesh, and 4 human fingers. He reported what he had found to his supervisor, Gary Wheeler. Both men returned to the property the following morning. By then, most of the drain had been cleared overnight, but scraps of flesh and small bones remained in a pipe that was connected to the top floor flat. The police were called. The bones were taken to a mortuary at Hornsey, where pathologist Professor David Bowen examined them and confirmed what everyone already feared. The remains were human. That evening, Detective Chief Inspector Peter Jay went to 23 Cranley Gardens and waited for the tenant of the top floor flat to come home from work. The man who walked through the door was a 37-year-old civil servant named Dennis Andrew Nilsen. He was quietly spoken, polite, and unremarkable in every way. Jay told Nilsen they had found human remains in the drains and asked him to explain. Nilsen did not run. He did not deny anything. He simply said, "It's a long story. It goes back a long time." Jay asked him how many bodies they were talking about. Nilsen's answer sent a chill through the room. He said, 15 or 16, since 1978. He then added, "I'll tell you everything." He was arrested on the spot. He even offered to make the officers a cup of tea. Dennis Nilsen had spent the previous 5 years murdering young men in London and getting away with it. He is known to have killed at least 12 people. The true number may be higher. He was a former British soldier who had served 11 years in the Army Catering Corps, where he trained as a cook and butcher. The skills he learned in the army, how to break down carcasses, how to cut through bone and tissue, how to portion things efficiently, were the same skills he later used to dismember his victims and dispose of their remains. He was known as the Muswell Hill murderer and, with grim irony, the kindly killer. Neilson was born on November 23, 1945, in Fraserburgh, Aberdeenshire, Scotland. His father, Olav Magnus Moxheim, was a Norwegian soldier who had come to Scotland during the Second World War and later adopted the surname Nilsson. His parents' marriage was unhappy. They divorced when Dennis was 4 years old. He was raised by his mother and grandparents. By his own account, the most important person in his early life was his grandfather, Andrew White. When White died of a heart attack in 1951, the 6-year-old Nilsson was taken to view the body in an open coffin. He later claimed this moment shaped everything that came after. His relationship with death, he said, began that day. He grew up quiet and withdrawn. He struggled to connect with other people. He became aware of his attraction to men as a teenager, but told no one. In 1961, at the age of 16, he enlisted in the British Army and began training with the Army Catering Corps at St Omer Barracks in Aldershot, Hampshire. He later described those 3 years of training as the happiest time of his life. He relished the structure, the travel, and the sense of belonging that military life gave him. He passed his catering exams and was posted to the 1st Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers in Osnabrück, West Germany, where he served as a cook. It was in Germany that his drinking became heavy, and his sexual fantasies, which had always involved passive or unconscious partners, began to grow darker. After 2 years in West Germany, he returned to Aldershot, passed further catering exams, and was deployed to Norway. In 1967, he was sent to the state of Aden, now part of Yemen, where he served as a cook at the Al-Mansoura prison. This was a dangerous posting. His regiment lost several men, often in ambushes. Nilsson himself was kidnapped by an Arab taxi driver, beaten unconscious and locked in the boot of a car. He escaped by attacking the driver with a jack handle. After Aden, he served in Cyprus and West Berlin. In January 1971, he was posted to the Shetland Islands. He left the army in October 1972 with the rank of corporal, having served for 11 years. After leaving the military, Nilsson moved to London in December 1972 and joined the Metropolitan Police. He lasted less than a year. He then worked briefly as a security guard before finding a position as a civil servant at a job centre in Kentish Town, helping unemployed people find work. He was active in his trade union. He seemed, from the outside, like a perfectly ordinary man. He moved into a ground-floor flat at 195 Melrose Avenue in Cricklewood, North London, in 1975. In 1977, his flatmate David Gallican moved out, leaving Nilsson alone. The loneliness consumed him. On the night of December 30th, 1978, Nilsson met 14-year-old Stephen Holmes at a pub near Cricklewood. Holmes had been to a rock concert and was trying to buy a drink. Nilsson invited him back to his flat. They drank together. The next morning, when Holmes tried to leave, Nilsson strangled him with a necktie. When Holmes was still breathing, Nilsson drowned him in a bucket of water. He then bathed the body, dressed it, and kept it under the floorboards for months before burning the remains on a bonfire in the garden. Stephen Holmes was Nilsson's first known victim. His family did not learn what happened to him for almost 3 decades, until police confirmed his identity in 2006. This became Nilsson's pattern. He would meet young men, often in pubs around North London. Many of his victims were homeless, gay or otherwise vulnerable, people whose disappearances were unlikely to raise alarm. He would offer them a meal, a drink, a place to sleep. He was described as charming and generous in these encounters. Once they were asleep or drunk, he would strangle them, usually with a necktie or a headphone cord, and then drown them if they were still breathing. One of his identified victims was Kenneth Ockenden, a 23-year-old Canadian tourist visiting relatives in London, whom Nilsson strangled with headphone cords in December 1979. Another was Martin Duffy, a 16-year-old catering student from Birkenhead, who had run away to London and was sleeping rough near Euston Station when Nilsson found him in May 1980. After each killing, he would bathe the body, dress it, and keep it in his flat, sometimes for days or weeks. He would sit with the bodies. He would prop them up in chairs. He talked to them. He created the illusion of companionship that he had never been able to maintain with a living person. When the bodies began to decompose, he would use the butchering skills he had learned in the army to cut them apart. At Melrose Avenue, where he had a garden, he would burn the remains on bonfires. To cover the smell of burning human flesh, he would throw a car tyre on top of the fire. The thick rubber smoke masked what was really happening. Between 1978 and 1981, Nielsen killed at least 9 people at Melrose Avenue. In 1981, he moved to 23 Crimley Gardens in Muswell Hill. This flat had no garden. He could no longer burn the remains. Instead, he boiled the flesh from the bones in a large cooking pot on his stove, and then tried to flush the smaller remains down the toilet. He cut larger body parts into pieces and stored them in bags around the flat. He killed at least 3 more people at Cranley Gardens. It was the remains he flushed into the drains that eventually blocked the pipes and brought the plumber to his door. Nielsen was charged on February 11, 1983, with the murder of his final victim, 20-year-old Stephen Sinclair, a homeless drug addict from Perth, whom Nielsen had killed on January 26, 1983. His trial began on October 24, 1983, at the Old Bailey before Mr. Justice Croom Johnson. He was charged with 6 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. He pleaded not guilty, claiming diminished responsibility. The prosecution, led by Alan Green QC, argued Nielsen was sane, fully in control, and had killed with premeditation. The defence, led by Ivan Lawrence QC, argued he was mentally impaired. 3 of Nielsen's surviving victims, men he had attempted to strangle but who had escaped, gave evidence against him. The jury deliberated for just over a day. On November 4, 1983, they returned a majority verdict of guilty on all 6 murder counts and both attempted murder counts. Mr. Justice Croom Johnson sentenced Nielsen to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 25 years. In December 1994, Home Secretary Michael Howard changed Nielsen's sentence to a whole life tariff. This meant Dennis Nielsen would never be released from prison. He accepted the decision and never appealed it. He spent the rest of his life at HMP Full Sutton in the East Riding of Yorkshire. In prison, he translated books into Braille, painted, composed music on a keyboard, and wrote extensively. He showed no remorse. On the day of his conviction, he said he took an enormous thrill from what he called the social seduction, the getting the friend back, the decision to kill, the body and its disposal. On May 10, 2018, Nielsen was taken from Full Sutton to York Hospital with severe stomach pains. He was found to have a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm, which was repaired by surgeons, but he developed a blood clot as a complication of the surgery. On May 12, 2018, Dennis Andrew Nielsen died. He was 72 years old. He had spent 35 years in prison. At least 4 of his victims have never been identified. They were young men whose names nobody knew, whose disappearances nobody reported, and whose deaths nobody noticed, until a plumber found their remains in a blocked drain in North London. Nielsen served his country for 11 years. He wore the uniform, he passed the exams, he cooked for soldiers, cooked for the Queen's Royal Guard, survived a kidnapping in Aden. And then he used what the army taught him to take apart at least 12 human beings in a kitchen in North London. The army gave him the skills, the loneliness gave him the motive, and a society that turned its back on homeless, vulnerable young men gave him the opportunity to kill again and again and again, for 5 years, without anyone noticing. He was cremated in June 2018, with only 5 mourners present, including 3 prison officers. No family members attended. His ashes were returned to his next of kin. He had reportedly asked for them to be scattered at the bottom of the garden at Melrose Avenue, the very place where he had burned the bodies of his victims. The request was refused. 5 cases, 5 British soldiers, 5 lives defined by the moment they crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. A sergeant in a field in Afghanistan, a corporal in the Pentland Hills, a former trooper with a crossbow in Bushey, a paratrooper at a checkpoint in Belfast, and a cook from Fraserburgh who turned an 11-year military career into a blueprint for mass murder. Some of them served with distinction. Some of them barely served at all. Some killed on the battlefield. Some killed at home. Some showed remorse. Some never did. The uniform does not make the man. What the man does when the uniform comes off, or while he is still wearing it, is what defines him. These 5 men proved that in the worst possible way, and the families they left broken behind them are still living with the consequences. If you found this deep dive worth your time, make sure to subscribe. I will see you in the next video.